Hello, my name's Dr. Nicola Lester and welcome to Trauma-Informed Notification and Family Liaison Officer Training. The main aim of this training is to provide you with a framework for practice which is underpinned by a trauma-informed approach. To do this, we'll start by working to understand trauma and traumatic bereavement. I'll then go on to explain what we mean by a trauma-informed approach and introduce its 6 key principles, drawing on a number of case studies to illustrate how these elements can and should be applied in both notification and family liaison. Whilst the training is intended to meet the needs of those who undertake formal roles, such as that of notification and family liaison within police forces, it can also be of relevance to other organisations, including the armed forces and their casualty notification officer and visiting officer duties, companies whose workforce operates in hostile environments overseas, and other statutory and non-statutory services who may become involved in supporting a bereaved family following a sudden death. Many of the key principles outlined in this training, the significance of choice and control, access to information, and the courage and creativity to challenge organisational processes which cause harm, are applicable regardless of your role and the context in which you work. Ensuring that those who are suddenly bereaved have access to the right support at the right time, delivered in the right way, is absolutely critical. Much of my work with bereaved families has been in the immediate aftermath of a death notification, in those first few hours, days and weeks that follow. It's also predominantly been with bereaved military families following the death of a service person on overseas operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. I'll be drawing on these examples alongside my work as a clinical consultant for a global private security company operating in hostile environments, my work with victims of terror and people affected by conflict overseas, including in Syria and Ukraine, and my work with the National Road Victims Service delivered by the charity Break, which provides support to bereaved families following a road traffic collision. I'll also be using data collected from my PhD research, which focused on exploring the impact of the military's response on bereaved families who experienced the death of a loved one in the line of duty between 2006 and 2017. For those who are familiar with the military's bereavement process, they use the term visiting officer to describe their approach to family liaison. However, for ease, when I refer to the research findings, I'll use the term family liaison to describe this role and the duties associated with it. Welcome to Section 1, Understanding Trauma and Loss. I begin this training with a quote from one of my research participants, a bereaved father whose son was killed in Afghanistan. He says, "No one can prepare you for the horror of war, much less for the horror of bureaucracy. Pen pushers and paperclip counters who've never faced anything can be inflicted on a grieving family with a grotesque blinkered approach." This goes to the heart of why we need a trauma-informed approach to traumatic bereavement. The recognition that in the darkest of moments, bureaucratic processes and the actions of those who encounter and engage with bereaved families in the immediate aftermath can compound experiences of loss, making what is already the most difficult time in someone's life even worse. What was particularly significant about the findings of my research was that the organisational and individual responses to loss had the potential to either compound distress or be a source of solace and support, sometimes both, at different times in the process which followed. Understanding how, why and where this can occur is absolutely critical to minimise the potential for harm and, wherever possible, to increase the potential that we might be able to provide comfort and hope instead. And indeed, ultimately, this is what a trauma-informed approach is concerned with. Understanding and accounting for the impact of traumatic bereavement in our engagements, working to mitigate its effects wherever and however possible, reducing the potential for re-traumatisation and harm, and actively seeking out opportunities to provide support and comfort throughout the process. Understanding the impact of traumatic bereavement. One of the challenges of working with traumatic bereavement is that trauma and grief are intertwined. In essence, this means that someone who's bereaved is not only grieving the loss of their loved one, but is haunted by the circumstances of their death. Most often this manifests as not being able to remember them in the way that they wish to. Instead, thoughts and memories are contaminated with the traumatic nature of how they died, increasing the intensity of their distress. They may experience nightmares, difficulty sleeping, a loss of appetite, fear and anxiety, intrusive thoughts and flashbacks, difficulties concentrating, confusion and overwhelm. All of these increase the suffering surrounding the pain of their loss. I often refer to Brené Brown's definition of anguish when talking about the impact of traumatic bereavement. In her book, Atlas of the Heart, she writes how anguish is an almost unbearable and traumatic swirl of shock, incredulity, grief, and powerlessness. Shock and incredulity can take our breath away, and grief and powerlessness often comfort our hearts and our minds. We are unable to change, reverse, or negotiate what has happened. And even in those situations where we can temporarily reroute anguish with to-do lists and tasks, it finds its way back in. For me, it is this definition which most accurately captures the profound impact of traumatic grief on what we see when we engage with those who are bereaved, particularly in the immediate aftermath of their loss. Accounting for the impacts of traumatic bereavement. Whilst we cannot change, reverse, or negotiate what has happened, we can alleviate the suffering associated with the loss by knowing and accounting for its effects. For many of us who engage immediately after a death, our work can often be task-oriented, which can be helpful in providing temporary relief and enabling opportunities for support and comfort within these processes, so long as we account for the ways in which trauma might impact on how someone can engage. So this includes slowing down and checking understanding, providing information in a way that's manageable and allows time for processing, being flexible and adapting your approach to feedback, providing choice wherever possible, asking what someone needs, seeking to understand concerns and priorities and not making assumptions, drawing on and mobilising wider networks of social support. Often those who are bereaved are so overwhelmed that it can be beneficial to help them to focus on what they need to do in the next hour or the next few hours and to work in much smaller chunks of time so as to support them to cope. Understanding our window of tolerance. Each of us have what's known as a window of tolerance, and when we are in our window of tolerance, we're able to think clearly, solve problems, make decisions, take perspective, be curious, and generally perform at our best. However, when someone experiences trauma, their window of tolerance becomes much narrower, and they are much more easily pushed outside of it into what's called their survival mode, because their brain thinks that they're in danger. And this survival mode can take two different forms, either hyperarousal, a flight or fight response, hypoarousal, a freeze or collapse response. When someone is in survival mode, their thinking brain simply switches off. It's not needed. And that's why it's so important to pay attention to whether or not someone is in their window of tolerance and to notice when they've moved outside of it. We may need to work harder and more creatively to bring them back inside of their window of tolerance so that they can engage with the process and perhaps more importantly with the support that's being offered. Welcome to section 2, where we introduce a framework for trauma-informed notification and family liaison practice. The 6 principles of trauma-informed practice. A trauma-informed approach is underpinned by 6 key principles, and it's these principles which can help us to create a framework for practice. These are safety, restoring choice and control, supporting coping, facilitating connections, responding to identity and context, and building strengths. Perhaps one of the most important aspects to emphasise here, though, is that these principles, and indeed the very idea of a trauma-informed approach, at its most basic, is simply about being human in our response. And so many of you will already be instinctively trauma-informed in your engagement with bereaved families, regardless of your background and your training. You will also notice that there's overlaps between each of the 6 principles. For example, providing choices is a crucial part of creating safety and building trust, and supporting coping helps us to build strength. And so ultimately what lies at the heart of a trauma-informed approach is the commitment to engage with people wherever they are and however they present. The courage to challenge organisational priorities and processes to ensure that the needs of the bereaved family take precedence, and the creativity to find ways to do this even when organisational policies are fixed and seemingly unyielding. Navigating and challenging organisational priorities. This can of course be more challenging to achieve though when there are things which need to be discussed or decisions which need to be made, and some of the systems that we work with and within are not always flexible, willing or able to account for the needs of the bereaved family. Indeed, this is where organisational power can be most harmful, as it seeks to prioritise bureaucratic processes over and above the needs of those who are bereaved, or fails to account for the ways in which trauma impacts on the capacity of the bereaved family to process information, to make decisions, or to advocate for what they want. This was particularly evident in the findings of my PhD research. However, it was the courage, commitment, and creativity of the assigned family liaison officer to prioritise the needs of the bereaved family wherever and however they possibly could that was most crucial in reducing the potential for re-traumatisation and promoting opportunities to provide comfort and support instead. So let's start by exploring the first principle. Creating a sense of safety in your engagement with a bereaved family is about honesty and clarity, seeking to understand what someone needs, their concerns, their priorities, and how they're making sense of their loss, compassion and kindness, humanity, and what many of my research participants termed as personalisation, the capacity of their family liaison officer to recognise and respond to their unique needs. There will be times in our work when we need to deliver some incredibly difficult and painful information to bereaved families. During such times, we may also need to pay attention to our own window of tolerance, as this can be stressful for us and may cause us to move beyond the space where we can perform at our best and instead activate a survival response. This can then leave us feeling overwhelmed and panicked, so rather than drawing on our humanity, we become disconnected and detached instead. An example of this can be found in this bereaved mother's account when she references her first conversation with her appointed family liaison officer only hours after being notified that her son had been killed in Afghanistan. He kept saying when the body comes home and when the body is this, and he would just refer to him as that, and then I completely lost the plot and I said, he's got a name, his name is Jack. In another interview, a bereaved father whose son was killed in a multiple fatality incident in Afghanistan recounted his experience at the repatriation when they went into the chapel of rest to sit with their son's coffin, only to be told minutes before entering that they did not know which coffin was which. Instead, he and the other 4 families stood in a room with 5 coffins, not knowing which was their son. There will always be challenges around identification in the immediate aftermath of a death, particularly those which occur overseas during times of conflict. To experience delays with identification will certainly compound experiences of loss. However, not to be told to anticipate this until only moments before shatters trust and safety. Honesty and clarity will not necessarily offer comfort during such times, but to not provide this will almost certainly have profound implications for the bereaved family and how they engage with processes and offers of support over the longer term. Whilst many of these processes will sit outside of your influence and control, please remember that you still have the capacity to exert influence by how you respond to this distress and what you can offer by way of validation and acknowledgement of this impact. And of course, that commitment to do whatever you can to mitigate its effects. It is also equally important, though, to highlight that trust can also be built in some of the smallest moments with seemingly inconsequential acts. Whenever I deliver training in notification, I always share the following quote from a bereaved mother who recalled their engagement with the notification officer who told them of their son's death. Every time we said something to him or asked him something, he wrote it down. That will always stick in my mind because he didn't want to get anything wrong. He said he was desperate not to do the wrong thing. Here we see how the intention to get it right for a bereaved family can not only compensate for inexperience, It should be noted that this was the first time this particular officer had carried out a notification, but that this intentionality can be experienced by a bereaved family. It can be felt by them, even at the worst moment in their lives. As the quote shows, it can and does bring them comfort. Finally, a sense of safety can be established by seeking to understand the concerns and priorities of the bereaved family. I'll talk more about this in later principles, but at its very basic level, this means asking a family what they need. I'll always recall the first bereaved family I ever met. It was a night before their son's repatriation, so only 48 hours after they'd been notified of his death, and I was absolutely terrified that I wouldn't know what to say to them, or that I would say the wrong thing. My clinical supervisor advised me to start by asking what they needed. So upon meeting the bereaved mother, I asked her this question, and she told me that she needed paracetamol and a glass of water. This advice has stayed with me over the past 10 years of working with bereaved families. Seeking to understand what someone needs in that moment will always give you a place from which to start. And perhaps most significantly, in amongst the helplessness and the overwhelm that I felt in the face of such distress and anguish, I found something that I could do to help. Whilst each of the 6 principles are important, in my experience, working to offer choices and to restore a sense of control are absolutely critical and can have a profound influence on a bereaved family's experience of loss. There are so many criminal, medical and legal processes in the aftermath of a sudden death over which bereaved families have no control. And so this is where it becomes even more important to find choices for them, wherever and however possible. This can be as simple as asking how they want to receive information and updates, in what form and how often, who do they want to provide them, and who else would they like to be informed. For the prisoner of war centre in Ukraine, which provides information and support to military families, the unprecedented number of deaths and those who were missing meant that often these were the only choices that they could possibly offer families. However, they found that when they did offer these choices, it did make a difference, particularly when bereaved family members were angry and distressed. Offering these choices was just enough to bring them back into their window of tolerance again. Restoring a sense of control over the process may also require advocacy to support a bereaved family to exercise those rights. For example, despite changes in policy and process, bereaved families continue to report that they were discouraged or even prevented from viewing their loved one. Such actions are often the result of well-intentioned paternalism to try and protect the bereaved family. In fact, though, research highlights the benefit of being able to view the person who's died, and that rarely is the decision to see their loved one a source of regret for bereaved families, but rather an important opportunity to confirm the certainty of the death and for connection. For the bereaved military families I both supported clinically and interviewed as part of my research, the so-called sanitising of their loved one's personal effects was still common, often taking place without their consent or knowledge. Even when it seems like the bereaved family can have no control over the processes which follow, there are always choices to be offered. For example, last summer I visited a bereaved family whose daughter had died in a road traffic collision. As part of the investigation, a decision had been made to remove her brain for testing, a decision which caused immense pain to her family as they felt unable to proceed with the funeral until the investigation was completed. During the wake that followed, they expressed concern that their daughter was being kept alone in the mortuary, particularly as she didn't like the cold. Making sure that they knew that they could take a blanket and a cuddly toy in to be with her was one way of restoring a sense of control for them as they waited for their daughter to be released to them. Finding choices wherever and however possible. Finding choices even when it seems like there are none available can have a significant impact on the experiences of the bereaved family, not least because it offers an opportunity to respond to their needs and priorities. And these efforts in and of themselves, regardless often of the outcome, can mean that a bereaved family feels much less alone in their grief. What I know from both my own practice and the findings of my research is that even in the most inflexible of policies and processes, even those that are enshrined in law, choices can always be found if we look closely enough. Supporting coping. Grief and loss remain a taboo subject in Western society. It's rarely discussed, but at the same time, those who are bereaved are often subjected to judgments about what they should be experiencing, when, and for how long. Supporting bereaved families to cope with their loss is about recognising that experiences of loss are unique and that we must meet people where they are, rather than where we think they should be or where we want them to be. This goes back to the importance of seeking to understand what people need rather than assuming that we know, of understanding their concerns and their priorities, of curiosity and humility. In my experience, there can be nothing more powerful than the reassurance that however someone who is bereaved is navigating their grief and the world around them is absolutely okay. I remember the case of another bereaved mother following the death of her daughter in a road traffic collision who visited her grave every evening. Every evening she would sit on the ground next to her, staying with her until midnight so that she wasn't alone. Such accounts often evoke concern and judgment, raising questions about what is normal, appropriate, acceptable, and adaptive. There are always times when support from a professional with a background in working with traumatic and complicated grief might be needed, if the person is ready to and wishes to engage with this intervention. However, a trauma-informed approach need only inquire, is she safe, is she comfortable, and is she warm? Does she need a chair to sit on and a light to guide her through the darkness of the cemetery when she's ready to leave? When we talk about supporting coping, what's most important is the acknowledgement that somebody is coping in the best way they know how, and the respect that we must demonstrate in return for how they do this. Supporting coping in the family liaison role. There are several different points in the process which follows a death where there are opportunities to support coping. These include taking the time to personalise the information that's provided, signposting to relevant support services based on this understanding of the needs of the bereaved family. So rather than just presenting a file with information, it's about taking the time to familiarise yourself with what's in that file so that you can refer to it and to support the family to then engage with those services which are most relevant to them. It's also about staying present and bearing witness to distress. Please don't ever underestimate how difficult it is to be in such close proximity to the anguish and grief of a grieving family, and the value of simply being present and bearing witness to this pain. And finally, it's about acceptance, validation, kindness, and compassion. Accepting however the family is coping without judgment, validating their experiences rather than trying to change them, fix, or resolve this pain, and offering kindness and compassion through the administration of those practical tasks associated with the role. Facilitating connections. The most powerful responses to any experience of trauma are connection and community. In the immediate aftermath of a death, seeking out opportunities to create connections with wider networks of support, such as extended family, friends, colleagues, neighbours, and members of the local community, is absolutely essential. Sometimes a death can have broader implications for families. They may lose their home, their place within a particular community, or even the country in which they live. And so what's most important to emphasise here is the significance of seeking out those opportunities to strengthen relationships within the family. And one way to do this is to make sure not to foster dependency or to take control through that family liaison role. For many of us who engage with bereaved families, we understand the significance of involving the wider family, recognising how they can be mobilised as a source of support. It's important to remember that a traumatic bereavement may create a strain on families, and so in our work we must be aware of this potential and take the time to try and strengthen relationships and family cohesion wherever we can. It's also necessary to think beyond our involvement, as it's relationships with family and friends which will endure and provide a longer-term source of support and comfort for a bereaved family. I'll give an example of this. In 2012, I worked with a bereaved military family whose loved one was killed in Afghanistan. Specifically, I worked with the serving person's mother to deliver the death notification to his 5-year-old brother. And it was probably one of the most difficult and harrowing things I've ever had to do in my career. As many of you will recall from the media coverage around this time, what followed a death in Afghanistan was a very public repatriation ceremony, where the service person was returned to the UK, and this was attended by the bereaved family. I offered to look after the 5-year-old child during the course of this day, so as to ensure that his mother had the time and space to do what she needed, as it often involved meeting a number of senior military personnel and other dignitaries who wanted to express their condolences. I spent the whole day with this child, and at several times I felt completely out of my depth. At the time I wasn't a mother, nor had I ever really taken care of a child before. He also asked questions, lots of them. He wanted to understand why his brother could not come home and be put to bed until he felt better. More specifically, he'd been told by his mother that his brother was a star forever watching over him, and he had some real concerns about how he could get from being in the coffin that he was seeing being driven through the street to take his place on that star. I ended up providing explanations that I didn't really feel qualified to offer, and perhaps most importantly, I realised afterwards that I'd missed an opportunity to work with the child's mother to identify and empower another family member who already knew the child, who would be available to them over the longer term to support them through that day and beyond, rather than introducing them to another stranger at a time of instability, confusion and uncertainty. At the time, I believed that perhaps my offering to take care of the child was about my need rather than his need or his mother's need. Before moving on to the next principle, I'd like to share another quote from a research participant, a bereaved wife whose husband was killed in Afghanistan. After his death, with the support of the family liaison officers who were assigned to both her and her parents-in-law, they worked really hard to sustain a relationship. 9 years later, she recalls the moment she told her mother-in-law that she was pregnant with her new partner. She says, "The day I told them I was pregnant last summer, my mother-in-law immediately burst into tears, absolutely delighted. I'm going to be a nanny-in-law." That's what she said. For this particular family, their way of paying tribute to their husband and son was to remember him well, which meant working to sustain their relationships with each other, even after he was gone. Responding to identity and context. Many of you will be familiar with working with bereaved families from a range of backgrounds. Responding to identity and context is about taking account of the ways in which bereaved families are different, with differing needs, priorities and concerns, and the importance of not making assumptions, staying curious, seeking to understand, and above all, practicing humility. To not recognise the individuality of bereaved families, and indeed even individuals within the same family, risks experiences being disenfranchised and needs being overlooked. Shortly before the first lockdown in 2020, I travelled to the Middle East with a bereaved fiancée so that she could see her partner following a fatal accident. The country didn't recognise same-sex relationships, and I was really concerned at the time that she wouldn't be permitted to attend the mortuary. And so I made a decision in the moment to tell the staff that she was actually a family member rather than a partner. I made an assumption when faced with that challenge that being able to see her loved one was actually more important than ensuring that her status was recognised. I quite simply forgot to ask her what she needed and wanted, and instead I thought I knew best. And in doing so, I risked disenfranchising both her grief and her love for her partner. Likewise, when I provided training to the Syrian White Helmets in their volunteer rescue roles, they struggled with the guidance that I provided around delivering the death notification to children, as I'd not accounted for how religion played a central part in meaning making within their culture and within their faith. We can never be familiar with every religion, faith, culture, set of social circumstances, family composition or community that we encounter, but what we can be proficient in is the commitment to challenge our assumptions, be curious and practice humility. Accounting for the needs of children and young people. Whilst it's unlikely that you'll be expected to have direct contact with children and young people, bereaved parents and caregivers may seek your advice regarding notification and how best to provide information to them or respond to their questions. In the resources, you'll find some additional information which can be shared with parents and caregivers about how to notify children and young people, and also some more general guidance to support them in the immediate aftermath. This includes trying to notify the child or young person as soon as possible, trying to minimise disruption to a child or young person's routine, so ensuring familiarity and consistency. These are both really important to help them to feel safe. Encouraging them to ask questions or to seek further information, and trying to respond to requests for further information as honestly as possible. It can be really useful to ask a child or young person what they already know and then to build on this knowledge. Often parents and caregivers believe that they've shielded children and young people from the more traumatic information that they may have been exposed to. But in the absence of information, children and young people likely fill the gaps for themselves. And so it can be really important to start by trying to find out what they already know and then correcting and adding to this. It's also important, wherever possible, to involve other familiar and trusted adults to help to support and take care of a child or a young person. Remember that example that I gave around the repatriation and stepping in and taking care of a young child. This would have been a really good opportunity to enlist the support of another adult. Above all, though, it's really about reassuring parents and caregivers that they know their child best and working with their preferences in relation to what they want to do next and how they want to manage the situation. Building strengths. Each of the preceding principles contributes to the idea of building strengths. It's hard to talk about recovery or healing in response to a bereavement, and there is increasing recognition that earlier theories of loss, which focused on passing through stages and reaching a magical place of acceptance, are perhaps not reflective of experiences of loss. In fact, such theories may even be harmful to those who are grieving by suggesting that they're not making progress or that their responses are problematic or not normal. We now know that grief is not something to be fixed or resolved, but an ongoing process of integrating the experience of loss and finding new ways to sustain or recreate a relationship with the person who's died now and for the remainder of the life of those who are bereaved. Such connection and integration can and does come in many different forms. The bereaved mother who spends time every day at her daughter's grave, the families who campaign for change or justice, set up charities, raise money in memory, or establish permanent memorials to remember their loved one. For some, these acts are intensely private. For others, sharing them with their communities, politicians, and the media is also part of the process. In her work on grief, Megan Devine, an American psychotherapist, writes how what has happened cannot be made right. What is lost cannot be restored. There is no beauty here, inside this central fact. Acknowledgement is everything. You're in pain. It can't be made better. The reality of grief is far different from what others see from the outside. There is pain in this world that you cannot be cheered out of. You don't need solutions. You don't need to move on from your grief. You need someone to see your grief, to acknowledge it. You need someone to hold your hands while you stand there in blinking horror, staring at the hole that was your life. Some things cannot be fixed, they can only be carried. One of the most powerful things that we can do when we bear witness to distress and anguish is to notice how heavy grief is to carry. To have the courage to know that it cannot be lightened or shared. Rather, we must focus on how we strengthen someone's capacity to hold their grief, and indeed their love for the person who's died, so that they might find a way of being in the world, able to hold their grief, but also able to find joy and happiness in life again. This final principle encourages us to make a distinction between the pain of grief and the suffering which surrounds the experience of loss. We can only notice how heavy grief is for someone to carry. However, there is so much we can do to reduce the suffering associated with the loss by ensuring that our responses and the responses of the organisations which we work with and within do not make it worse, and wherever and however possible, provide opportunities for comfort, support and hope. Often bereaved families ask if they will ever recover, and it can be helpful to share with them Lois Tonkin's theory called Growing Around Grief. It describes how in the beginning there is only grief. It is all-consuming, crowding out any capacity to experience hope, happiness, joy or colour in the life of those who are bereaved. People think that grief slowly gets smaller with time, as though healing from grief means that it's magically no longer there, disappearing from sight. In fact, it doesn't ever get smaller. It remains the same shape and size, but slowly life begins to grow around it, taking up more space around the grief as you reconnect with and rediscover things in life which give you joy, pleasure and happiness. This theory of grief allows us to move away from those assumptions which so often permeate discussions around loss and mourning. There are no rules about when and how quickly someone should grow around their grief. Instead, it provides space and time for grieving without judgment to do what it is that they need to do. So often in those early days after a loss, families will ask if the pain ever gets easier or disappears. and I share with them this theory of loss to explain that their grief and their love for the person who's died will remain with them always, but that over time there will be room for other things in their life again. It will continue on, and there will be moments, fleeting at first, of hope, optimism and joy. I give examples of the birth of a grandchild, someone graduating from university, a christening, a wedding. Sometimes years later, I receive emails with photographs of these grandchildren, these weddings, these christenings, these graduations, and it is a poignant reminder that whilst time will not heal, it will allow someone's world to open again, so that the weight of that pain becomes more bearable, and alongside that darkness of grief, there is also the most amazing colours. Welcome to section 3, where we focus on notification in practice. This next section takes us through the key stages involved in a notification process. It's important to highlight that you are likely to come across a range of circumstances in the role of notifier, and so what follows is intended as a guide but may need to be adapted depending on the context in which you work and the circumstances of the incident. For example, there may be occasions when it's not possible to deliver a notification in person, and instead it will need to be done over the phone. Likewise, you may notify initially of a serious injury and then need to emphasise the prognosis to ensure that a family fully understands its severity and the likely outcome. However, the 6 principles of a trauma-informed approach to family liaison can create a useful framework to guide you, regardless of the circumstances, and so these aspects will continue to be highlighted during this next section to demonstrate how they can be integrated into practice. A starting point is to think about how to prepare for notification. Wherever possible, it's suggested that the notification be carried out in pairs to make sure that a lead notifier has support from their colleague, and also means that someone else is available if children are present or if there's a need to step outside and call another family member or a neighbour for support. It's useful to decide who should take the lead, for example, who's the person delivering the notification, and who should take on the role of assisting and supporting them. However, it's also really important to remain flexible and responsive to the situation as it arises. For example, if the lead notifier finds it challenging in that moment to deliver the notification, or if the assisting notifier notices them struggling, they should be willing and able to step into that lead role instead. Making sure that you have the most accurate and up-to-date information available is also critical, as well as checking details such as the person's identity, as any mistakes can have a really profound impact on the bereaved family's capacity to accept, understand, and process the information. I always advise writing a notification script so that you have something tangible to refer to. This reduces the potential for mistakes to occur or for the notifier to become overwhelmed and be unable to deliver the notification. The script should be relatively brief, and within the first sentence or two should state clearly that the person has died or is critically injured. Language is really important. There should be absolutely no room for ambiguity, and words like dead and died should be clearly stated, even if they feel uncomfortable to say out loud. In many of the training workshops that I deliver, participants volunteering for this role express real discomfort at these terms, and so it can be really useful to prepare that script and to practice reading it out loud so as to get used to these words. Delivering the news and responding to questions. Upon arrival, you should start by confirming the identity of the family member before proceeding further. You should ask if you can enter the home and try to move away from the hallway or the doorway to somewhere where everyone can be seated. However, this may not always be possible, and a family member may demand the information as soon as you identify yourself, in which case it would be advisable to proceed with the notification regardless, so as to not to delay it any further. The lead notifier should break the news gently, but firmly and with compassion. If they've not been able to move from the entrance or the doorway at this point, you should try to encourage the family member or members to go inside the home and sit down. Absolute clarity is vital, no matter how difficult it is. Using language like dead and died is essential so that there can be no ambiguity. For example, if someone is critically injured, it is equally important to give them a prognosis if you can. For example, they are in a critical condition and not expected to survive. This can help prepare a family for what will happen next. You may need to repeat the notification several times. Try to use the same words so as to minimise confusion, and don't add additional detail until the family asks for it. This will reduce the potential for overwhelm. This also allows you to respond to their priorities and what they need to know, rather than assuming what they need to know at this stage. Other tasks during the initial notification visit could include notifying other family members. Part of that process of mobilising wider family and social support may mean that you should notify other family members, either in person or via a telephone call. However, wherever possible, you should be offering a choice to the family member as to whether or not this is something that they may wish to do for themselves. Providing additional information about the circumstances as far as you're able to. It can be useful to share further information in response to specific questions, as this will enable you to address the family's immediate concerns. A key aspect of the notification process is to ensure that the family is aware of what will happen next, and if you have concerns about a family's capacity to retain and process this information, it can be really helpful to write it down so that they have it for reference. Often family liaison officers will leave a notebook with the family and encourage them to write down what comes to mind. A few points to remember. Be cautious when giving information. It can often be very tempting to say something to offer comfort, but if this later turns out not to be accurate, then it can impact on the extent to which a family trusts you and the wider organisation that you represent. Document any questions and concerns and explain who you will pass them on to. This can be a really helpful way of managing and regulating your own emotions during the process and ensuring that no information is missed. If you think back to the earlier quote from the research, when the notification officer wrote down everything that the family wanted to know, they felt supported, heard, and comforted by him. Be self-aware and access support from your colleague. No matter what your background and level of experience, this will likely be one of the hardest things that you will ever have to do. The presence of children or young people may complicate the notification process. A parent or caregiver may wish for them to remain present, in which case you may need to adjust your language to account for them hearing the notification. Wherever possible, the assisting notifier should suggest accompanying them to another room. However, the choice as to whether or not that happens should always belong to the parent or caregiver. In the resources, there is additional guidance about notifying children and young people, which it can be helpful to familiarise yourself with or to share with a parent or caregiver. Finally, you should expect irrational and random questions. Families may not always behave or respond as you would anticipate, and so it's important to ensure that you remain non-judgmental and try not to make assumptions. So to summarise, the priorities for the visit include supporting family members to inform others, ensuring that someone, for example another family member, a friend or a neighbour, attends to remain with them prior to concluding the visit and leaving the home, responding to and documenting any immediate concerns or questions, ensuring that the family is safe. Depending on the family's access to social support, you may need to involve other professional services such as mental health services or the family's GP to help to address any immediate needs. There are a few other key aspects to remember. It's essential to refer to the person who's died by their given name during the notification visit. If you notice that the families shorten their name or they use another name, check how they wish for you to refer to the person. It can also be helpful to match the tense with which they refer to the person who's died. For example, if they continue to talk about them in the present tense, you should try and mirror this as far as possible. It's important to remember that it's not your role to help a family to accept or to come to terms with the loss, but rather to support them to cope with what has happened, whatever this might look like. There is no easy way to notify the family of a fatality. If you think that you have said the wrong thing or regret something that you might have said, acknowledge it openly, be honest and apologise, and ask the family what they need from you. In my experience, the intention to get it right for them, coupled with kindness and compassion, will make a significant difference to the family and can compensate for any mistakes or inexperience. Managing initial reactions. You are likely to see a range of different emotions during the notification process, including anger, intense distress, confusion, fear, disbelief, overwhelm, denial, numbness, and dissociation. This is completely normal, although it can be really frightening to witness the intensity of these emotions. It can be helpful to think about these responses as survival responses, remembering that flight, fight, freeze, and collapse response. Ultimately, the priority is to ensure that everyone is safe, both the family and also yourselves. Try to mobilise their social support networks as quickly as possible. Remember to ask about children and their whereabouts. Work to stay within your window of tolerance. Think about what you need in order to regulate yourself. Write down any questions that they have and take breaks if you need to. Explaining to the family that you need to step outside and make a telephone call to get an update can be a really useful way of ensuring that you get that opportunity to take a break. Remember that being present and bearing witness is support. And don't forget to ask what they need and try to address this however and wherever you can. Understanding anger. A really common response to a death notification is anger. It's important to remember that anger often protects us from overwhelming heartbreak and pain, and so can be useful in such moments to help somebody to bear and tolerate that pain. In Atlas of the Heart, Brené Brown describes anger as an emotion which occurs when we believe that there has been a violation of the way things should be. A sudden death profoundly shatters our assumptions of the way that things should be. She goes on to say that when we feel anger, we believe that someone or something else is to blame for an unfair or unjust situation, and that something can be done to resolve the problem. Anger is an active emotion. We want to do something when we feel it. Anger is also a full contact emotion. It activates our nervous system and can hijack our thoughts and behaviour. This is particularly important to appreciate during the notification process, as it may mean that some of the information which is provided goes unheard or only partially heard. Likewise, there is a risk that the notifier will be required to absorb someone's anger, and this can be challenging to do. In order to remain present, it can be useful to remember that anger is protecting unbearable pain and to focus on bearing witness rather than responding to, trying to fix, reduce, or solve the anger. However, remaining present and bearing witness also needs to be balanced against personal safety, and everyone will have a different threshold for what they're able, expected, and willing to tolerate, as will the organisation that you represent. This is where working as a team can be really useful, and strategies like writing down questions and concerns can be a useful way of demonstrating that you've heard what someone has told you and assuring them that you intend to take some form of action. Checking that you have understood someone by reflecting back what they've said and giving them the opportunity to correct this information can be a good way of responding to anger and at the same time building trust and increasing a sense of safety. It's also essential to clarify what you intend to do with their concerns and to update them as to the outcome of these actions, even if the outcome is not what they might have hoped for. These updates are also particularly important if there might be a delay or long wait for answers for additional information. In the aftermath of a traumatic bereavement, there are many things which are outside of our control and those we seek to support through the process. However, we can make a commitment to be honest, open and transparent and to acknowledge and validate the anger and frustration that a bereaved family might be experiencing. So remember that behind anger is hurt, betrayal, heartbreak, anguish, sadness, grief, guilt, shame, disgust and disappointment. You do not need to fix or resolve anger, or indeed any other emotion, only to bear witness, stay present and accept the response. However, you can ask someone what they need and try to give them choices, even seemingly small choices. For example, I can stay here until someone else arrives, or I can wait outside in the car. I can write down these concerns now and escalate them, or leave you with a notepad to document questions over the next few hours to give you the chance to speak to other family members to make sure that nothing is missed. Remember that what we are trying to do here is to restore some sense of control over a situation that feels overwhelming, frightening, and ultimately outside of anyone's control. Staying in your window of tolerance. One of the most important aspects of the notification process is the ability to try and stay within your window of tolerance. This may be challenging to do when you're faced with high levels of distress and intense pain and grief. It can be helpful to try and stay focused on what you can do rather than those things that you can't change. Sometimes doing something such as taking notes, making a cup of tea or offering to contact another family member can help to keep you regulated and prevent you from experiencing a sense of helplessness and overwhelm. When working as part of a team, regardless of your role and level of experience, make sure that you notice and take care of your colleague. It's almost inevitable that there will be times in the process when you step outside of your window of tolerance. You may become frustrated or show emotion. It's important to remember that this is a very normal human response to bearing witness to pain and distress. It doesn't mean that you're not robust enough for this work or not professional enough, but that you are human and that you care. Taking breaks is essential, particularly if you spend long periods of time with a family. It can also be useful to think about the ways in which you can regulate yourself. What helps you when you feel overwhelmed? What do you need? When I notice this in myself, I try to focus on something in the physical environment, such as the colour of the carpet, or I occupy myself by making notes. This gives me just enough time and space to move back into my window of tolerance. However, different things can work for different people, so try to reflect beforehand about what's worked for you in the past when you felt overwhelmed, stressed and distressed. In summary, the key skills needed are the willingness to bear witness to pain and distress, the courage and commitment to stay present, the ability to notice and withhold judgment, the intent to act with compassion, empathy and kindness, the capacity to stay curious and practice humility. For those of you who are accessing this training as a group, this practical activity can be a really useful way of preparing you for the notification role. Working in pairs, create a scenario which is relevant to the context in which you work, and from there develop a notification script. Remember to keep it brief and to make sure that the actual notification itself takes place as early as possible. Pay attention to language and take some time to reflect on how it feels to both write and read the script out loud. Welcome to Section 4, Family Liaison in Practice. In this section, we'll be exploring several aspects of the process, which include identifying and viewing the person who's died, attending the scene, mitigating the impact of postmortems, managing the return of personal effects, understanding the legal process, ongoing liaison, including the use of language, tense, not knowing and saying the wrong thing, and how we manage endings. Identifying and viewing the person who died. Most importantly, it's essential that the family understands their right to view their loved one. The family liaison role can support them to make this decision by ensuring that they have access to all of the information that they need. This should be specific, honest and accurate. That they're given options for how they can view their loved one. That they are prepared as much as possible, for example using photographs or speaking to mortuary staff first. That they are supported by family, friends and professionals throughout the process. And finally, that they are given as many choices as possible. It's important to remember that it's not your role to advise or protect the bereaved family, but to inform them and ensure that they know and can exercise their rights. Whilst it can be incredibly painful to see their loved one, the research actually suggests that few bereaved families regret taking this decision. What's most important is to ensure that the bereaved family have access to information and are supported throughout the process. However, if this choice is taken away from them, it can be a significant source of harm which exacerbates their level of distress and can further compound their grief. Whilst this is so often well-intentioned paternalism, it takes power and agency from the bereaved family. This is something that many of the bereaved military families reflected on in my research, their desire to see their loved one and the impact of this being denied. Indeed, many of the bereaved families who were able to view their loved one had to fight in order to do so. Attending the scene. Depending on the circumstances of the death, some bereaved families may also wish to visit the place where their loved one died, either in the immediate aftermath or later. In the event that someone wishes to visit the scene in the immediate aftermath, this again should be their choice. However, you can help to prepare someone for what they're likely to see, hear, smell, and be able to touch. It will be important to provide time and space at the scene, whilst also ensuring that support is available throughout and afterwards. You should also be prepared that someone may find it extremely distressing to attend the scene. However, this doesn't mean that it was the wrong thing to do. Always seek out opportunities to ask them what they need and offer choices wherever possible. On the following slide, there are 2 quotes from 2 of my research participants, both bereaved mothers, one who explains her desire to visit Afghanistan and the other who, after years of campaigning, was escorted by the Ministry of Defence to visit the country. Both illustrate the importance of visiting the place where their sons died. In her interview, a bereaved mother said, "I need to see where he took his last breath. I need to be there." In another interview, another bereaved mother said, "Some people can't understand why I wanted to go there, and I can't always put into words. But I just felt like it was somewhere where I should have been when he needed me, but I was going to get there anyway, somehow." Mitigating the impacts of postmortems. Another key area to pay attention to in the family liaison role is that of the impact of postmortems. For many bereaved families, this represents yet another loss of control, ownership, and access to their loved one. As such, it's important to ensure their access to information, explanations, and to provide regular contact. Even when there is no update, continued contact can make sure that families do not feel forgotten. It can be powerful to validate and acknowledge their frustration, even if there is nothing that you can offer which could change the situation. And most significantly, finding out what choices you can offer them. Remember earlier on in the session the choice that was offered to a bereaved family to bring a blanket to the mortuary for their daughter who didn't like the cold. In the family liaison role, you're in a unique position to understand the needs of the bereaved family, to push boundaries and be creative to ensure that these needs are acknowledged and addressed, however and wherever possible. On the following slide, I include a quote from my research where a bereaved wife describes the impact of not being able to see her husband following his repatriation from Afghanistan until after a post-mortem had been conducted. She explains how, "I felt I had really lost control of the situation, because when he'd been brought home, the military had swept his body away, taken it off to the pathologist and were controlling when I could see him." She goes on to say, "My rational brain knew that, and knew that it was going to take some time, but I couldn't stop the emotional feeling that his body felt like MOD property and not mine. That was really hard to stomach, hard to understand, hard to let go of, and just let the process happen. It sounds like quite a morbid thought, but all I could think of was if I see him in 6 weeks' time, his body would have deteriorated so much. It won't look like him anymore, and I won't be able to see his face. That was just really distressing. I could not wait 6 weeks to see him. I had to see him as soon as possible, while he still looked like him, you know? Those are the kind of morbid thoughts that torment you, really." For this particular research participant, her desire to be able to see, sit down next to, and have a conversation with her husband was so strong that her family liaison officer worked tirelessly to ensure that she was able to see him immediately after the post-mortem had taken place, prior to him being released to the local funeral directors. This provides yet another example of the ways in which the family liaison role can be used to seek out flexibility in the processes which follow a sudden death, to enable the needs of the family to be both heard and met. Managing the return of personal effects. The possessions of someone who's died often hold great significance to a bereaved family, and it is important to ensure that they're given a choice about the state in which they're returned. Despite progressions in our understanding about the impact of this choice and clear best practice, sometimes these choices are still taken away from a bereaved family, again, as agencies and professionals seek to protect them from pain and further distress. The following quote from the research highlights the importance of preparing bereaved families for the state in which personal effects might be returned and ensuring that they remain supported throughout this process. You'll note in this particular case the bereaved mother was not provided with a choice about whether or not she wished to receive her son's blood-stained clothing. And whilst later in her interview she expresses gratitude that she has this, it's a critical reminder to make sure that information is shared so as to inform the choices provided to bereaved families. She recalls how there was nothing on top of the box, it was just a big brown box, nothing saying what was in there. As I opened the box, the top of it, there was a clear plastic bag with the dog tag around it and in red writing, "T-shirt worn in incident." Cuss up in the middle and blood on it. That was a complete shock. It completely shocked me. Everything that was in that box, unwashed. I thought, how can you not have prepared me for that? On the following slide, there's a quote from another bereaved mother which illustrates the significance of receiving her son's clothing unwashed. She explains how, "I've got his t-shirt, the last thing he wore, and it stunk of sweat when it came home. I've got that under my pillow. It's fading. You can't smell it as much now, but I used to smell it because it's the last thing he ever wore." And so, in summary, choice is essential, and making sure that the bereaved family have access to information to inform this choice. Preparing someone for what they'll receive, what it will look and smell like, and the damage that they may see. Managing expectations and explaining any delays. It may take a number of days, weeks, or even months for personal effects to be released depending on the circumstances of the death, and so it's essential to provide up-to-date information and to offer explanations in relation to any of these delays. Ensuring that support is available. Support should remain available throughout the process, from the initial discussion right through to the return of the personal effects. Remember to ask bereaved families what they need. Offering avenues to ask questions, seek further information, or to raise concerns. Whilst there have been significant progressions in this area, and there is clarity regarding what is best practice, sometimes this either doesn't happen or simply isn't possible. Ensuring that bereaved families can give feedback and have their experiences heard is critical, so as to continue to develop and learn from practice. This also offers other opportunities for the bereaved family to feel heard and as though their experience matters. Understanding the legal process. There are a number of legal processes which follow a sudden bereavement, including a coroner's inquest. Whilst it is not expected that the family liaison role be used to advise the bereaved family of their legal rights, a commitment to the principles of trauma-informed practice requires that you make the bereaved family aware of this process and of where they can access further information. This aspect was particularly significant for bereaved military families, as in some cases the Ministry of Defence would be legally represented, and several of the research participants outlined the impact of being able to access both legal advice and, in some cases, legal representation, and the ways in which this helped them to ask the questions that they most needed answers to. The Voicing Loss project is a really useful source of information to share with bereaved families and can be accessed at www.voicing-loss.icpr.org.uk. Ongoing liaison. The circumstances of the loss, the organisation you represent, and the needs of the bereaved family will likely impact on the duration of your engagement with the bereaved family. However, it can be useful to consider how you're going to manage your ongoing relationship with them. This should be informed both by their needs and your capacity to meet these needs. It may be that if their need exceeds what you can provide, you'll need to draw on wider support from other organisations. It's also important to think about the level of commitment that you can offer, not just in the immediate aftermath, but also over the course of the processes which follow. Honesty, clarity, and transparency are absolutely key. It's important to explain clearly what you can and can't do, and to create boundaries around your liaison role. Essentially, boundaries are a way of letting someone know what to expect, and in doing so, it helps to create a sense of safety and build trust. It can also be useful to try and anticipate what might be helpful for a bereaved family to know. For example, how they can contact you, what your availability is, what timeframes you'll respond in, what will happen if you go on leave. It's also important to remember that what you can and can't offer may shift and change over time, and that this is to be expected. It can be helpful to acknowledge any changes and their impact, and provide an explanation so as to prevent bereaved families from feeling as though they've been forgotten or abandoned. Most significantly, it should be recognised that the role is an incredibly privileged one. You will bear witness to families at their most vulnerable, be invited into their homes and their lives, and come to know the person who's died. This role and the relationship that you develop with a bereaved family should be treated with the utmost respect and care. Some advice about your use of language when engaging with a bereaved family. Throughout your engagement, you should try to mirror the words that they use in relation to their loved one. If they shorten their name, ask how they wish for you to refer to them. Reflect the tense with which they talk about the person. For example, they like or they liked. Avoid terms like closure, acceptance, or suggesting that they will feel better or that it will make them stronger. Avoid praising them for their resilience or strength. Grief is unique, and it's essential to accept however someone is coping with their loss without trying to fix, solve, or resolve it. Finally, you should know that it's okay to ask questions about the person who has died. Most bereaved families will welcome this. They'll want to show you photographs, videos, or share their memories of their loved one as a way of keeping them alive. In every training workshop that I deliver, participants always share their fear of saying the wrong thing or not knowing what to say. This is completely normal, and no matter how many cases or how experienced you are, this is a healthy response and shows that you care and desperately want to get it right. If you don't know how to respond to something which is shared or discussed, it's okay to say, "I'm so sorry, I don't even know how to begin to respond to what you've shared." You could then go on to ask what they need. If they don't know what they need, offer choices. Often people will know what they don't need. If you regret something that you've said, wish you'd said it differently, or are concerned that it's had a negative impact, acknowledge this and say sorry. In most cases, this will not only repair any ruptures, it will also strengthen the relationship as well. Managing endings. No matter how effectively you implement boundaries around your role, or even how responsive bereaved families are to these, endings can still be challenging for those that we work with and for ourselves. It can often be helpful to acknowledge this challenge. To do so humanises you and the loss that they've experienced. It means that it mattered and that so do they. Providing bereaved families with information about how to access ongoing support and what's available to them can help ensure a smooth transition of contact and care if they wish to engage with these services. Depending on the nature of the relationship that you've had with the bereaved family, you may also wish to mark your conclusion of the relationship in some way, for example with a letter or a card. This can be a really useful way of ending the relationship but also reflecting its significance. For many of the research participants, abrupt or unexpected endings with their family liaison officers constituted yet another form of loss for them. And when this wasn't managed with care or consideration, bereaved families were left feeling confused, forgotten, or abandoned, and this is a risk which needs to be mitigated wherever possible. So to summarise, the key principles for trauma-informed family liaison practice: offering choice wherever and however possible, honesty and absolute clarity, creativity, flexibility, and the courage to challenge and question processes, self-awareness, reflection, and self-care, seeking feedback, the importance of restorative practice as a central part of the role, specifically the capacity to say sorry, acknowledge harm, and learn lessons, demonstrating that both the death and the experience of the bereaved family matters. No training workshop on traumatic bereavement would be complete without taking the time to acknowledge the impact of this work on our own lives and on the ways in which we see the world. Working with bereaved families in the immediate aftermath of a loss is a heartbreaking privilege, no matter what our role or remit. Every one of my research participants shared a story of a person who was loved, of the gap that they left behind in their lives and their families, and of all the ways in which they would remember, honour and memorialise them. I was shown photographs of young men and women who would not age and taken to stand in the doorway of untouched bedrooms which waited for them to return home again. We bear witness not just to grief and pain, but also to love, the power of human connection and the ways in which it transcends all life, and this is a heartbreaking privilege. All that remains is for me to take this opportunity to thank you for your courage and commitment to this work, and to remind you of the difference that it can and does make in the darkest moments of someone's life. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to contact me directly.